Hello and welcome. What has really changed in the lives of the Afghan people since the US invasion 9 years ago? American forces there reached a major milestone last week. They've now been in Afghanistan longer than the Soviet Union, which withdrew in 1989. The US and its allies invaded in 2001, aiming to drive out the Taliban and establish a democratic system, giving equal rights to women and protection to minorities. And billions of dollars have been invested since to rebuild Afghanistan's institutions and infrastructure. But critics say the situation there has not really changed, with thousands dying in an ongoing Taliban insurgency funded in part by a flourishing drug trade. Corruption is rampant at every level of government, and basic necessities such as education and health are still out of reach for most ordinary Afghans. Today we ask, in a country that has historically resisted foreign occupation, how can the US and its allies make a difference? Remember, we welcome your emails and text messages on the show. I'm joined now by Caroline Wadhams, Director for South Asia Security Studies at the US-based think tank Center for American Progress. She believes the US military and its allies should leave Afghanistan by the NATO timeline of 2014. Also with me is Ahmed Majidyar, Senior Research Associate at the conservative think tank American Enterprise Institute. He recently spent 6 weeks in Afghanistan and believes international forces need to stay until that country is stable. I welcome you both to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Caroline Wadhams, if I could start with, what significance do you place on this idea that the US has been in Afghanistan longer than the Soviet Union was there now? I mean, is that a major symbol of failure that America's got itself into a quagmire it just can't pull out of?
I'm not certain about that. I mean, I think it's still difficult to say exactly what it means. Clearly, there have been improvements for many Afghans. You have now the majority of Afghans have access to health care. You have more children in school than under the Taliban. You have roads built, government institutions stood up. A lot of things have happened that are for the benefit of Afghans. You have thriving media, roads, I mean a number of things, but clearly I think we see with the security situation that it's continuing to deteriorate, and it's not clear that the United States is going to be able, with its NATO allies, to create greater stability in Afghanistan.
I know you believe in a 2014 timeline,
yes,
that the forces should stay till that NATO deadline. We had an email, if I could put to you, from a viewer in Afghanistan. Nasir Momand says, after the Russian withdrawal, there was a civil war in Afghanistan, and history might repeat itself when the US withdraws, leaving the country divided. Are you optimistic that the country can stand on its own 2 feet once the troops do pull out, or is there still a fear of all-out civil war?
I think at this point, if we withdrew, there would probably be a civil war. I think factions would turn on each other. I think the goal for the United States and for NATO with Afghan partners is to try to transition out slowly without igniting that civil war. And I think what I believe needs to happen in order to prevent the state from collapsing is serious political reforms that address some of the political exclusion of people in the South and East, and also there needs probably to be some kind of negotiation with certain factions of the insurgency. I don't think without that there will be long-term stability in Afghanistan.
I'll get on to some of those issues in a moment, but I want to bring in Ahmed Majidyar. Good to have you with us as well. Now I know you believe in the forces remaining there until the country is stable, but recent history has shown that that's potentially a very, very long time. Would you believe in an indefinite presence if needed?
Well, I very much doubt that by July 2011 or also by 2014, the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government should be able to take complete responsibility both for security and for governance in Afghanistan.
Let me get an email question to you then on this issue. A viewer in South Africa Abu Tariq wrote in saying, there is no improvement, the war is still going on, and anti-Western sentiment is growing. The Taliban is more popular now than ever. So how do you answer critics who say, it's the presence of foreign troops that actually triggers, the insurgency, that allows the Taliban to have the fuel to recruit, that they can say this is an occupation?
I wouldn't agree with the fact that the Taliban are more popular in Afghanistan now as a result of the presence of the international community. We see in the recent elections, we noticed that over 5 million Afghan men and women went to the polls despite the Taliban threats. So that in itself was the voice of Afghans rejecting the Taliban. And many recent polls show that, of course, the Afghan people have some of their frustrations with the international community. They have very high expectations. But if you ask Afghans, that whether or not international forces should remain in Afghanistan, the answer will be yes.
Caroline Williams, let me ask you about that. You were an observer at the recent elections that took place in Afghanistan. Many critics say the US paints a much rosier picture, saying, look, we had elections, you know, there's democracy on the way, or at least it's established and so on. But there's a feeling that perhaps the West let the people of Afghanistan down by not scrutinizing those elections more, or at least questioning the outcome much more.
I mean, I think the United States is still trying to, they're still waiting, the U.S. government and NATO is still trying to figure out what the final results of those elections are. I mean, they've been, this was the first Afghan-led electoral process. The international community fully funded this effort. But I do think we've seen with the allegations of fraud, there continue to be problems with the electoral process. You know, part of it's due to a number of different things. I think the voting system, that's a single non-transferable voting system, also is problematic, just because of the way that votes end up getting divided among different people. The political party system is not strong enough. The Independent Electoral Commission has also been looked at as potentially not impartial enough for President Karzai. There are numerous problems. I think the U.S. and NATO needs to put more attention, put more pressure on President Karzai to undertake electoral reforms, but they have been trying to do a lot. It's not that they've just let the Afghans do this election on their own. They have been trying to support this process. But I think we've seen, as with the presidential election, that this process was not as good as we had hoped.
Ahmed, a question from a viewer for you, if I may, sir. Amira Khalil in the USA wrote in terms of the election, of course, supporters of the campaign there cite the inclusion of more women in the government. And Amira wrote in saying, the women in the current government are merely symbolic. Women are still forced to wear the burqa for security reasons and are still targets of radical warlords. And do you believe there was much change when those kind of examples are cited?
I believe that there has been a lot of progress on the parts of women and women's rights, and also participation of women in the socio-political spheres in Afghanistan. If we compare it to the Taliban or any era in the history of Afghanistan, women are more actively involved in political and social spheres in Afghanistan. We see that we saw in the elections, in the September elections, that more than 400 women contested the polls despite a lot of intimidation by the Taliban. And 69 women have won seats in the parliament. So this is a very big achievement on the part of women. But unfortunately, we still have a lot of violence against women, as we see a lot of cases of self-immolation in Western Afghanistan, forced marriages. More than 80% of women are subject to forced marriages in Afghanistan. But those problems will take more time and long-term commitment of the international community to address. But when we are measuring progress of women in Afghanistan, we have to look back 10 years ago and see where we started. At the time of the Taliban, when women were barred from schooling and they were not allowed to work, and even going back to the 1980s during the communist era or any time in Afghanistan in the past.
I'm going to try and get a couple more emails from viewers out to you. And Caroline, this one's for you, if I could. Madandola Ilyas in Nigeria wrote in saying, freedom cannot be imposed, it can only be demanded. So Afghanistan's freedom is the business of the Afghan people, not anyone else's. And I wondered to what degree, with all the the politicking that's gone on, with the focus on the politics of the elections and the infrastructure building and the militarization of aid and all these things, that the actual people, the voice of the Afghan people, has been lost in all that politicking.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to say what the Afghan people want. Many times we try to rely on polls that come out of Afghanistan, but I think a lot of people are highly skeptical about what those polls actually mean and whether they're accurate. And I think we've seen again and again for Americans, for U.S. policymakers, and even for NATO, that there often is a real disconnect between what the international community wants and what they believe Afghanistan needs and what Afghans want. We've seen that with the differences between President Karzai and General Petraeus about these night raids, just as one example. You see there's this disconnect. Then again with the Taliban imposter, there was a sense that the U.S. and NATO didn't know who they're dealing with. They don't have a sense enough of the culture of Afghanistan or the individuals, the power dynamics to intervene effectively. It's very difficult. I think there's been an attempt to make this more of to get more Afghan inputs into this process, but I think, again, there's oftentimes it's been too sort of international community driven and not Afghan driven enough.
It's been imposed, essentially. Yeah.
There's been an attempt not to impose, but I think largely I don't know if I would go so far as to say impose, but it's been too directed from the outside.
But Ahmed, you were talking just a moment ago about how things have improved over the last decade at least, maybe even the last 2 decades. I'm going to squeeze in one more email here from Aisha Asraf, who wrote in saying, the US invasion of Afghanistan leaves the people in the same position they were in when the Soviets left. Now, obviously there are going to be some basic differences, but when I was just referring to the idea of ideas being imposed on the Afghan people, or at least them having less of a voice, what's your view? Is there a comparison?
I would say that now is very much different from 1992 when the government of Dr. Najibullah collapsed, or even in 1989 with the Russians left Afghanistan, because at that time there was a very unpopular government in Afghanistan that its rule was limited to Kabul. But now we see that the rule of government at least prevails in 80% of the country. We have more representation from ethnic minorities, and former jihadi leaders have become now part of this political structure in Afghanistan. But of course, the enemies are still there. The Taliban are still fighting, but that takes time.
How much credibility do you think President Hamid Karzai has, considering he was in favor, then out of favor, then sort of back in favor, almost accepted now by the Western allies as there's no alternative kind of figure? And I wonder, how much credibility he has among the people there because of this toing and froing.
Of course, President Karzai has his supporters and also those who opposes him in Afghanistan. His popularity undoubtedly has declined tremendously. When I was in Afghanistan working in 2004, his favorability rates amongst the ordinary Afghans stood at 83% or above, but now it's below 60%. So of course, continued insecurity and lack of development and changes on the parts of the ordinary Afghans has affected his popularity to a great extent. But the elections again showed that he still has his social base in Afghanistan and still has his supporters.
Caroline Wadhams, I'd like to get your perspective on that. That recent WikiLeaks revelation, the release of those confidential documents, targeted, obviously showed the contents of comments about many countries, but Afghanistan's memos included a picture of US officials describing Mr. Karzai as, quote, extremely weak and, quote, driven by paranoia, and highlighting his brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, as extremely corrupt. So I wonder, where does this leave the Afghan people who, are looking for some faith in their leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think those allegations about President Karzai and the tensions between the U.S. and President Karzai have been around for some time. This is nothing new. I mean, it's very difficult. We have seen that the popularity for President Karzai has declined. I mean, I don't think that the U.S. or NATO feels that there is an alternative, and whether you disagree or not with the elections, they have put President Karzai in place, and he's not going to be changed at this point. So we have to just continue with him, work with him, but put pressure on him. Well,
I have more questions for you both. We're going to take a very short break here. When we return, border battles. To what extent is Pakistan affecting the stability of Afghanistan? We'll be right back. Welcome back. More than 9 years after the Taliban was driven from power, Afghanistan is still mired in corruption, violence and instability. Well, Pakistan has a major stake in Afghanistan, and many believe Islamabad is playing politics. Discussing those issues and others with me are Caroline Wadhams of the Center for American Progress. She served as an American election observer in Afghanistan's parliamentary elections in September this year. And Ahmed Majidyar is with the American Enterprise Institute, who instructs U.S. military officers on culture, religion and the domestic politics of Afghanistan. And Ahmed, if I could before we get on to Pakistan, if I could put a couple of questions to you about the sort of situation with the Taliban and the inclusion of various parties. Originally, the US went into Afghanistan with this mission of wiping out the Taliban. But it seems to have turned around and accepted the Taliban as a part of the social fabric of Afghanistan's culture. So what prospect is there of some kind of inclusion of Taliban in a much more comprehensive manner, which might lead to more stability?
Peace talks with the Taliban indeed is not something new. The government of President Karzai has been in talks with the Taliban leaders since 2002, since their fall. However, that has not achieved any progress yet. And I think that it's not also now the right time to negotiate with the Taliban. First of all, the Taliban genuinely believe that they are winning the war, as violence is at worst in Afghanistan since any time over the past 9 years. And the Taliban have spread insurgency not just in their heartland of southern Afghanistan, but also to more peaceful areas in the north and western Afghanistan. So they are believing that they are winning the war. So now the government of President Karzai and the coalition forces cannot negotiate with them from a position of strength. And secondly, the Taliban leadership, especially the leadership based in Quetta, Pakistan, led by Mullah Omar, has shown no willingness for any negotiations at all. They have persistently rejected any peace talks, and we've seen that the past increased efforts by President Karzai has not borne any fruit. And indeed, it has done more harm than good.
And actually, that leads me, Caroline Wadhams, to this issue of the porous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan and the influence of the Taliban in Pakistan. How much that complicates the situation when trying to find stability and security?
Well, I mean, I think that's the big problem. I mean, you have there are two sort of fundamental difficulties, two fundamental challenges for the U.S. and NATO as they're trying to extend this Afghan government. The first is that they have an Afghan government which has, I think, an increasing problem with legitimacy for Afghans themselves. And then also you have this safe haven on the Pakistan side of the border where insurgents, it's not just the Quetta Shura, but the Haqqani network, you have HIG, who are able to return to that area to strengthen, rest, train, and go back. So it creates this endless supply and ability to rejuvenate. So it's a huge problem, and the U.S. has tried to address this issue in the Pakistan border through a combination of I think, although they won't admit it, the drone strikes, but then also more money to the Pakistani military and more money to the civilian efforts to try to change strategic calculations around why they're continuing to support sanctuary. So it's a multifaceted effort.
Actually, that's true, isn't it, Ahmed? It's a very complex dynamic when you have the U.S. Relationship with Pakistan made more complicated by the drone attacks. That again provides more fuel for recruiting those who might have anti-American sentiments and anti-Western sentiments. You've got the issue of the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan not always being that easy either. So how is this dynamic going to be balanced in at least in time to give Afghanistan some independence to reach any of these deadlines for troop withdrawals?
Well, in my recent trip that I spoke to a lot of Afghan officials and also some very influential figures in Afghanistan, they were expressing a lot of frustration with the United States not putting enough pressure on Pakistan to dismantle those safe havens which exist in Afghanistan, which exist in the border regions along the Afghanistan and Pakistan, especially in the Quetta and also in North Waziristan. So this is also one of the reasons which strains relationship between Kabul and Washington as well. That we see that President Karzai, his advisors have expressed time and again that we cannot win this war unless Pakistan take on those terrorist havens inside Pakistan. And also in the recent WikiLeaks, again, that refreshed our minds about the fact that a lot of elements within the Pakistani security forces, military, and also the intelligence agency, the ISI, are still supporting the Taliban. So until that there is a shift in policy in Pakistan, which can be possible with increased pressure from Washington and NATO allies, then it is very difficult to win the war in Afghanistan.
Caroline, there's also been this issue of accusing the government in Kabul of having a bunker mentality, being focused largely on Kabul and sort of the nearby regions, but not having enough focus on the whole of the country. How do you regard the idea of devolving power to the regions a bit more, to be more inclusive with the tribal leaders and try to set up more of a devolved government and leadership, decentralizing the...
Yeah, I mean, I think that the state was established on a highly centralized model. And people were hoping, I think, they did that so that to prevent its further fragmentation. They didn't. I mean, it was intentionally done so that you wouldn't have these power brokers emerge and that there would be different centers of power. But I think what we've seen is that model is not serving stability in Afghanistan. It's not based on how governance has worked historically in Afghanistan. And what's happening right now is you have President Karzai basically he has all of the power of appointments. All of the resources are going through him, and he's trying to delegate it out. And I think that the only way that you're going to have stability over the long term in Afghanistan is if you are able to empower more local government. And there's been an effort to do that to a certain extent, but it's still all of the budget authorities, all the appointments, all the power is really in Kabul, and then it's trying to be extended down. Of course, there's another problem at the same time which you have to recognize, which is that a number of different power brokers and warlords have also become incredibly powerful. Some of them are linked into President Karzai, some are not. Some of them have been empowered because of U.S. dollars, and that's also another issue that you have to deal with simultaneously.
Well, Ahmed, about 40 seconds to go. So there's a number of issues. There's this issue of devolution of power, the drugs, which are still causing a major problem, and then the issue of creating some kind of stability within the Afghan forces themselves to make the country self-sustaining. You know, can you see this happening with the right kind of within the right kind of time frame?
About decentralization, as Caroline mentioned, in the long term, we have to look into that. But at present time, we have to also bear in mind that the tribal structure, the strong tribal structures which ruled Afghanistan over centuries, they have been very much weakened. So they are not in the shape that existed before. So when we are talking about devolution of power, there are a lot of problems which will be associated with that as well, because a lot of power brokers are still in power. And secondly, about the drugs issue in Afghanistan is very much closely related to security issues. In the provinces which are very secure, we see that they have become poppy-free, while in Helmand and Kandahar, which are the center of insurgency, we see that they produce more than 60% of the whole drugs produced in Afghanistan.
Of course, the issue is with so many questions and never enough time. I thank you both for taking part, though, in the show.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us, too. Remember, you can download a podcast of the show from iTunes. This week, we're featuring a discussion on global food justice with writer and activist Raj Patel. On the next show, Brazil in the spotlight. Foreign Minister Celso Amorim gives us his perspective on the growth of Brazilian influence on the world stage and how the country is approaching issues ranging from security to economics. Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.